All right, hello everyone. After a little bit of a long break, we are back. This will be uploaded by early Thursday afternoon. I don't foresee any issues. Excuse me. Hold on one second. Sorry. I don't still can't get it out. I don't foresee any issues with uploading this to YouTube this time. This should be a lot shorter than the last one, maybe about a half hour. For this video show should be up and fine. No discussion this week, only a primary source analysis. Okay, so only one thing for you guys instead of two. Um, Basketball was the sport that won out among you guys on the survey I sent you. So I will do a lecture next week on basketball. I got to prepare a little bit for that. That should maybe by later this week or early next week. For your primary source analysis for this week, I'm going to give you an extra couple days because I took a little bit too long to put this video up. So I'll give you till Tuesday to do that. But so far, so good from you guys. You've been doing your stuff on time. You've been doing what I've asked you to. Really taught me to do better to catch up to grade this stuff to give you guys feedback. So I'm very happy so far with what we've seen in here. And yeah, we got about a month left, a little bit more than a month, about 5 weeks left. So let's keep up the good work. So I'm going to now start sharing my screen. Yes. All right. So I'm calling this unit 2. Um, it's not really its own unit per se. This is sport in wartime, right? So we're going to focus mostly on Civil War, World War One, and World War Two. It doesn't really fit in with the other areas that I have in the other units, Unit 1 and Unit 3. And while it's probably too short to be its own unit, I want it to be a standalone thing because I do think it's important to look at how sport functions during wartime in America, because it has a very important role to people during those times. Okay, so we shouldn't ignore it. We also shouldn't just say, college football in the 1940s is the same as the 1920s. It's not. Baseball in the 1920s is the same as during World War One. It's not. Okay, so we have to look at it through a different lens. All right, so here are the 4 key themes I would say here. One is sport as patriotism, right? Patriotism basically means love for your country. If you break that word down, really means like love for your fatherland, right? Patre means father in Latin. You get padre, father in Spanish, right? That's where you get it from. It's love for your fatherland. Sport is seen to build that patriotism during wartime when it's probably most necessary to have. Okay, sport as simulated combat. What do I mean by that? Well, if you've ever done maybe like a flight simulator or something like that, right? The simulator is that it's showing what a real experience would be like, but it's not the actual real experience, right? If you crash in a flight simulator, you don't die. A lot of people saw sport as a simulation of combat. It's preparing you for combat without having you die if something goes wrong. And we're going to look further into that. Building soldiers. Okay, if you played sport, you were seen to be built as a better soldier. Get more into that. And then finally, wartime is a time to spread sport, to make this a particular sport spread beyond its close boundaries, wherever it started. Okay, so let's talk about war in general at this time, and sports relationship to it. So the 19th century. Now, let's be clear. 19th century is the 1800s, right? So you have the Civil War happening then in America. You have the Mexican American War. You have the War of 1812. And at the very end of the 1800s, you have the Spanish American War in 1898. But in general, in America and in Europe, especially, there are fewer wars and they're shorter than in previous centuries. And this is not something that people have just remarked about after the fact. People during that time were like, oh, wow, like, all these technological advances we have are going to be able to reduce war forever. Maybe we'll never have another big war. They're wrong in that, okay? But they were right to recognize that the wars were getting shorter and fewer and farther in between, which seems like a good thing, right? And I would agree that it's a good thing if you have fewer wars, less people dying. But the mindset of people at that time is Well, during wartime, that's how we prove our masculinity to other nations. That's how we prove we're more dominant than another nation. If we don't have that, how are we going to keep our men masculine? This should sound familiar from common concerns about industrialism and urbanism in the 1800s. Okay. People are really worried about how to maintain masculinity. And if you cut off those traditional routes of masculinity, being a farmer, um, going to war for your country, etc., people are kind of scrambling to find another way to prove that masculinity. Sport, right? Sports are a way to do that. And like I said before about the simulated combat, sports are believed to be a way to gain the benefits of war without death. Okay, so what do I mean the benefits of war? Camaraderie, right? Be able to work with your fellow soldiers, or in sports case, your fellow teammates to achieve a common goal. Um, Physical bravery, physical courage, right? It takes a lot of courage to be able to run a crossing pattern over the middle in football, knowing that the safety is probably going to deck you right after you catch that ball, right? It takes some physical courage to go again to play football. Okay. And building that physical courage, building that camaraderie, building that fearlessness was seen as a great way to prepare men for war. And I'm saying especially football because of the more physical nature of it. Um, Baseball is not a combat contact sport. It's not even a collision sport. Football, you definitely would consider a collision sport. We're going to look at how people kind of differentiated between football and baseball through a comedy sketch. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of George Carlin. He's one of the most famous comedians in America, probably ever. He died, about 15 years ago, I think. He has a really famous sketch where he compares baseball to football and the relative, how should we say, physical benefits of each is part of it, right? The physicality, he kind of distinguishes between them, but he also distinguishes between the warlike metaphors used in football as opposed to baseball. And as he's going to go through his routine, you're like, oh yeah, okay, I remember all those times that football has been referred to with military terms, but I've never really thought about it in that case. He's going to put it pretty clear for us, but he does it in a humorous way. I think that's what humor can do sometimes. It can explain some complex concepts in a simple way, make you laugh along with it, right? So we're going to watch this video.
I'd like to talk a little bit about baseball and football.
I'm going to turn closed captioning.
Starting with baseball. Baseball is different from any other sport in a lot of different little ways. For instance, in most sports, you score points or you score goals. In baseball, you score runs. In most sports, the ball or the object is put in play by the offensive team. In baseball, the defense puts the ball in play, and only the defensive team is allowed to touch the ball. In fact, in baseball, if an offensive player touches the ball intentionally, he's out. Also, most sports, the team is run by a coach. In baseball, the team is run by a manager. And only in baseball does the manager or the coach have to wear the same uniform the players do. Can you picture Bill Parcells in his New York Giants uniform? Now, baseball and football are different from one another in other kind of interesting ways, I think. First of all, baseball is a 19th century pastoral game. Football is a 20th century technological struggle.
You see, he's going to start making distinctions here.
Baseball is played on a diamond, in a park, the baseball park. Football is played on a gridiron in a stadium, sometimes called Soldier Field or War Memorial Stadium.
We talked about those stadium names before after World War I.
Baseball begins in the spring, the season of new life. Football begins in the fall when everything is dying. In football, you wear a helmet. In baseball, you wear a cap. Football is concerned with downs. What down is it? Baseball is concerned with ups. Who's up? Are you up? I'm not up. He's up. In football, the specialist comes in to kick. In baseball, the specialist comes in to relieve someone. In football, you receive a penalty. In baseball, you make an error.
He's going to get to the military metaphors in about a minute here.
Football has hitting, clipping, spearing, blocking, piling on, late hitting, unnecessary roughness, and personal fouls. Baseball has the sacrifice. Football is played in any kind of weather. Rain, sleet, snow, hail, mud. Can't read the numbers on the field, can't read the yard markers, can't read the players' numbers. The struggle will continue. In baseball, if it rains, we don't come out to play. It's raining out. Baseball has a 7th-inning stretch. Football has the 2-minute warning. Baseball has no time limit. We don't know when it's going to end. We might have extra innings. Football is rigidly timed, and it will end even if we have to go to sudden death. In baseball, during the game in the stands, there's kind of a picnic feeling. Emotions may run high or low, but there's not that much unpleasantness. In football, in the stands during the game, you can be sure that at least 27 times you were perfectly capable of taking the life of a fellow human being. Preferably a stranger. And finally, the objective.
Here's where he launches into the military part.
Totally different. In football, the object is for the quarterback, otherwise known as the field general, to be on target with his aerial assault.
Sure, I gotta make sure that it's not about to kick me off here. Yes, I'm still there. I hate to cut that off in the middle. Let's go back to where he starts this, because it's really important to watch this part. All right.
The object is for the quarterback, otherwise known as the field general, to be on target with his aerial assault, riddling the defense by hitting his receivers with deadly accuracy, in spite of the blitz, even if he has to use the shotgun. With short bullet passes and long bombs, he marches his troops into enemy territory, balancing this aerial assault with a sustained ground attack which punches holes in the forward wall of the enemy's defensive line. In baseball, the object is to go home and to be safe. I hope I'll be safe at home. Safe at home. I'd like to talk a little bit about baseball.
All right, so I think that's a fantastic way to.
Baseball.
Hold on. There we go. Let's try this again. Okay, so sorry we got cut off in the middle there a little bit, and then I had to get by it. Should put us past this here. There we go. But I think that's a great way of explaining how oftentimes we think of football in terms of combat. Notice all the military metaphors that were used there. You know, the shotgun, the field general marching his troops into enemy territory, bullet passes, long bombs. Right? You know, we don't really think about it, but Americans have kind of merged football with war in terms of our ideas of masculinity, right? And a lot of times people see baseball as maybe more effeminate or maybe more soft because there isn't that physical nature in baseball as there is in football, where there's a lot more hitting and tackling. And back in the day, people could die. Theoretically, you still could die from playing football, right? So I think George Carlin does a really great way. I mean, first of all, it's funny, but he kind of puts things in a perspective you hadn't really thought about before. And it does do a great job of explaining how people, even to this day, but especially back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, thought about football, especially as simulated combat. Like these are guys going to war just without bullets and guns. And we'll get a little bit more in depth into that in the next 15 or 20 minutes here. Okay. So the Civil War, this is the 1861 to 1865. If any of you guys have family members in the military, they could probably confirm this to you. But if you're a soldier, even to this day, you have a lot of downtime. Okay. Even if you're not, even if you are overseas actually fighting in battle, you'll definitely see combat, right? If you're over there, you're gonna get some instances where you're facing bullets. But a lot of the time, you're in camp just kind of killing time. It might be a little bit less today than it was then. Um, but if you have family or friends in the military and they're in the United States at a certain camp or base, a lot of time is just downtime. And how are you going to fill that downtime? Well, officers didn't want their soldiers off carousing, drinking, you know, um, spending time with women, right? All that kind of stuff. They wanted them to be more focused, okay, more disciplined. So playing cards might be one way to do that, although gambling might be encouraged, and they didn't. So officers didn't necessarily want that happening. But really, sports were a great way to kind of alleviate that boredom, right? To kind of shake the lethargicness off of yourself, and like, hey, let's go play some baseball. Let's kill 2 hours here. Let's have some fun. Let's be competitive, right? We're kind of simulating combat here in a way. We're using our free time in an edifying way. Okay, so baseball is pretty new in the 1860s, but a lot of the soldiers who come from the New York area, remember the New York game is the one that becomes dominant in baseball. They said, "Hey, listen, you guys, if you don't know about baseball, I know you might play town ball or rounders or whatever bat and ball game you play. We play baseball here from New York and from Connecticut and from New Jersey. We're gonna have a game here in the camp. You want to play?" And that's how it play. That's how it start, right? You spread the knowledge of this game through the different soldiers mingling with each other, playing this game that otherwise might not have had contact with it, right? If you live in Illinois, yes, there are trains and telegraphs by now, but still, you're probably not mingling with many people from New York. Okay. If you're from Nebraska, if you're from out past Nebraska, right, into the really far west at that point, you're not mingling with many people from the East Coast. But now that you're fighting for the Union, okay, you're a Minnesota soldier fighting for the Union, you're going to meet guys from the East Coast, and they're going to basically teach you baseball. Okay. So after the war ends, now all these new soldiers, and includes some Confederates too, right? The Confederates who are in Union prison camps would learn how to play baseball. They're spreading this game to wherever they went home to. Okay. So for instance, one of the guys I've done a research paper on, his name's Albert Spalding. If you know the Spalding company for their sports equipment, right? Spalding balls, Spalding, whatever. It's that guy. He found Spalding sports equipment. But he learned the game from soldiers coming home from the war, right? He was a young boy in Illinois, and he knew people who were coming home from the war, and they taught him how to play baseball. Okay. So you really see the Civil War as an agent of the spread of baseball, okay, especially South and West, since it really starts in the East. Okay. Let's talk about World War One a little bit. Um, so some really basic rundown is that World War One takes place from 1914 to 1918. Tens of millions of people die. Okay, that's including civilians. This is the greatest war, and he was great not in the sense that it's really cool, like great as just in the vastness of its size. The biggest war anybody had ever seen, right? And now let's remember historically they don't call it World War One while it's happening because they don't know there's a World War Two. Generally, it's called the Great War. Okay, um, it's the most terrible war anybody's ever seen. America doesn't come until 1917. America's out the first 3 years. They kind of finish off the war in 1918, but they still lose hundreds of thousands of men. Okay. But there's a big debate in the U.S. about when to enter the war. Should we enter the war? Should we not? When should we enter it? And there are a lot of instances throughout that are affecting that, right? Because at first it's just a European war. Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets shot in 1914 in June. All these nations who have alliances with each other, now that triggers those alliances, and now they're all coming into war against each other. U.S. is across the Atlantic saying, hey, we're fine over here. But the Lusitania gets sunk in 1915. If you heard of Lusitania, it's an ocean liner that had American citizens on it. German U-boats sink it. People are, we got to go in now. They don't go in yet. There's a Zimmerman telegram, which is essentially a telegram from a German diplomat to a Mexican diplomat saying, hey, Mexico, you come in. If you declare war against the U.S., we're going to help you out with that. And of course, Americans freak out again. Really what draws the U.S. finally into war is that the Germans, they have their U-boats, which are submarines, After the Lusitania, they kind of pulled back on the unrestricted U-boat warfare. They said, all right, well, we're only going to target military vessels like the British. The British are in the war against us. The Russians, we'll just target them. We're not going to target you, the U.S. By 1917, stuff's going pretty bad for Germany. They need to take a chance. They need to take a gamble. And they reopen the unrestricted submarine warfare, which means they start to hit American vessels again. And finally, this is just too much, right? America comes into the war on the Allied side in 1917. So really, we're looking at 1918 here. It takes a while for the U.S. to mobilize into war. The Army was very small before the war happened. It was only about 100,000 men, which sounds like a lot, but the armies in Europe are in the millions. So it's going to take a long time for the kind of, the U.S. machine to get out of neutral here, the war machine, right? We got to start manufacturing weapons. We got to start drafting troop. Well, the draft does come. It's called selective service, but it's essentially a draft. We got to start taking troops into the military. We got to do all these things to get us ready to go overseas. So 1918 is really what we're looking at here. Major League Baseball still plays the season in 1918, but the season is shortened. Originally, it was supposed to be shortened by the end of July. There was this order that was called Worker Fight that was sent out around that time. And Worker Fight essentially said, you're either going to be subject to the Selective Service Act, which is the draft, essentially. You're either going to be subject to that to go fight overseas. Or if you're not going to be a part of that, you have to fight in an industry that's clearly aiding the war effort. So what does that mean? You're you're working in factories that are manufacturing bullets, rifles, tanks, stuff like that. You might work at a shipyard that's building warships. Okay. That's the type of industry we're talking about. Baseball doesn't fall under that. And baseball's like, hey, can we get some kind of exemption here? We're really important for the public morale. People love sports. It's a distraction for them. We really need it. And the government's like, no. So they do give Major League Baseball a short extension. That they're allowed to finish it in September, not October, which it would usually be. They give them an extra month, basically. But after that, you got to work or fight. So even Babe Ruth, who is becoming a star by this point, he's not quite there yet, but he's becoming a star. Babe Ruth's considering going to work in a shipyard to avoid being subject to selective service to the draft. Okay. Some Major League Baseball players do see service overseas, not many. I believe only 2 or 3 pass away fighting World War I. Okay, a lot of times they're working in these war industries, right? So they are often drafted, but usually it's in the war industries, not the military itself. So baseball season was a little weird that year. Also, as you may know now, over the last 2 years, we've probably heard a lot about the 1919 influenza pandemic. That's starting right at the end here. And that's really going to affect the 1919 seasons of these sports as well. So if you see, any kind of sport with a shortened season in 1919, probably because of the flu. 1918, it's because of World War One. Okay. And a brief note about other sports. Basketball, there is professional basketball at this time. It's not long lasting. It's not lucrative. People aren't making a lot of money. It's a very small sport in the American consciousness. There aren't a ton of basketball fans out there yet. So we're going to wait to get into that till next week. But basketball is not a big thing yet. Hockey's still very much a Canadian sport. There are no American teams in the NHL until I believe 1924 or 1925. So hockey's very much Canadian. Really, I think I mentioned this before, but it's horse racing, baseball, and boxing. They're the top 3. College football is close behind that. College football is like a secondary 4th option there. But it's gaining ground on those top 3 sports. So college football, and we mentioned the NFL doesn't come around until 1920, and even then, it's not a big deal. The NFL doesn't become really a competitor of college football until probably the 1960s. So really, we're talking about college football here. College football is in an interesting place too. The government comes down with a dictate saying, "Hey, listen, college football teams, we will let you play in 1918, but you have to include military drilling for your teams." So what does that mean? If you guys know what ROTC is, Reserve Officers Training Corps, it means basically you can go to college and still come out of college being an officer in the military. These people are regular college students, but they also do military drills. They do PT. They do these various military things to learn about the Army or the Navy or the Air Force before going into it, right? That's essentially what they were turning all college football teams into in 1918. Basically, a huge ROTC corps. Okay. It wasn't just them, it was other college students too, who were basically being required to learn military drilling, you know, learn how to handle a weapon, learn how to march in formation, learn how to shine your boots, stuff like that. You might wonder, well, why? Well, they're the ages you're going to get soldiers from, right? 19, 20, 21, 22. Unfortunately, war is a young man's thing. The young men are the ones who die in it. Um, so they're prime targets, college football teams, to prepare soldiers for, right? We talked about before, sport is seen to build that, especially football, build that ideal body for a masculine person, for a soldier. Okay, so the government's definitely going to look to college football teams to make soldiers. So they're allowed to play, but they have to have some military aspect to their practices. They can't just be regular students playing football, practicing football, studying their classes. There has to be military drill involved. Okay. I'm going to show you some pictures. The top left. So, first of all, I got some of these pictures from the National World War One Museum. I actually visited the National World War One Museum a few weeks ago in Kansas City. Highly recommend if you're ever in the area checking it out. It's pretty incredible looking from the outside. And they also have some interesting stuff on the inside. Um, but here, this is a camp for soldiers where they're learning how to be soldiers before they go overseas. Camp MacArthur, it's in Waco, Texas. It's where Baylor University is, if you're familiar with that. So first of all, these guys are in the military dress at the time. You'd wear a hat like this. You'd wear these short kind of breeches, these pants, and here's the military top. So these guys are in the military. They're playing football during their free time. Okay, notice how you have that Model T type car in the background here too. They're playing football in their spare time. Down here, if you follow my cursor to the bottom right, excuse me, I believe this is a U.S. Army Signal Corps unit. The Signal Corps is basically the guys who can communicate between regiments or between battalion, whatever units of the Army. So they might be telegraph operators, stuff like that. Okay. They form a team. They're forming a team to play each other in football, right? They even have leather helmets here. Okay. They're in football formation. If you see the guys in the background, these guys are all military dress as well. So this is on a military base. These guys are playing football. Let's go to the top right. This is baseball, right? This is the Cleveland. I think by this time they called themselves the Indians. Cleveland Indians baseball team. They're practicing drill before a game. Notice those are rifles, right? They're not baseball bats. They're rifles. And we have some kind of general here, or at least officer from the Army, training them in some basic military marching, some basic military formation. Okay. This would be common to see during World War I if you went to a baseball game. And then the bottom left, you have an issue. I believe that's Baseball Magazine. Actually, that might not be. That is a sports magazine, and it's showing, hey, look, Uncle Sam's on the cover. He's ready to go to war, and he's got a baseball bat in his hand. Right, Uncle Sam's at the plate. We're still playing baseball. We're still fighting war as well. You see this image a lot. This kind of imagery a lot. Uncle Sam with a baseball bat, seen to represent America. Baseball is seen to be kind of an ultimate patriotism. So World War One sports are still very much a part of World War One. World War II. So this is 1939 to 1945. The United States is not getting involved until 1941 after Pearl Harbor, which is December 7th, 1941. This one's even bigger than World War One. Okay, the Great War. I don't want to say it pales in comparison because that would be a wrong term, but World War II is more all-encompassing. Okay, more soldiers are being inducted into the armed forces in America. More weapons are being produced. It's all encompassing America. This is America for 4 years is war. Even the people on the home front, everything about what they do is related to the war. They have to ration their food, ration their gas, contribute to war bonds to help the government buy these things they need to fight the war. Okay. And Major League Baseball is still getting players drafted. Okay. Now, a lot volunteer. So I believe Bob Feller, if you've heard of him, he's a Hall of Fame pitcher, is the first player to volunteer to be in the military, but he's not the only one, right? Plenty of players are drafted or volunteer their service. Some of them do see combat, right? Bob Feller was on a ship in the Navy. Ted Williams becomes an aviator, right? He flies planes, and he even volunteered for the Korean War 5 years later to fly planes again there. Um, but most of the time, they're basically in the military to play baseball, which sounds kind of weird, right? So why can't they just play baseball at home? Well, if they're in the military itself and they're playing baseball on these bases or these camps, it's going to raise the soldiers' morale. They get to see, wow, Joe DiMaggio is playing baseball right here. This is amazing. I get to see him play. Right? DiMaggio is an example of a guy who really didn't see combat. He was basically in the military to play baseball. Okay. But it's not just the major league players, right? Regular soldiers are playing baseball in the camps, right? If you're on the front, you're playing baseball, just like the Civil War, just like World War One. Okay. But Major League Baseball does get to keep playing, and we're gonna put a pin in that for right now, and we're gonna come to it on the next slide because it is your primary source analysis. Primary source analysis is related to that. Let me just make sure I'm not getting kicked out here. All right, good. I got it. College football is interesting as well. Now, college football is not required to do military drilling. Okay. However, a lot of these guys are still going to be drafted into the services. So what ends up happening is that a lot of college football players, when they're drafted in say the Navy or the Army, they go to these training stations before they get shipped overseas. And what ends up happening is these training stations become powerhouse college football teams. You're like, wait a second, that's not a college. Yeah, it's not a college in the strictest sense, right? The Great Lakes Naval Station is not a university. However, they are college football players. They still have eligibility to compete in college. They're competing as their own team against other colleges. So if you look at your favorite colleges, whatever team that might be, if you look at their schedule during the 1940s, you're going to see some really weird team names like Iowa Pre-Flight, right? What is Iowa Pre-Flight? It's a pre-flight school in Iowa to teach kids or to teach soldiers how to fly, how to be aviators. They formed a football team. Some places might have something with artillery after it. Yeah, they're learning how to be artillery soldiers. Great Lakes Naval Station is probably the biggest of these powers. Great Lakes Naval Station was awesome. They were a really good football team during the war. So the regular colleges themselves are struggling because they're losing a lot of these great players to these training stations. Notre Dame's one of them. Notre Dame barely survives World War II open as a school. Really, the only way Notre Dame stays open is that it comes to an agreement with the Navy to have a naval training station on campus. And that is the reason why Notre Dame has agreed to always play Navy every year if Navy wants to. They've only missed that once since World War II, and that was in 2020 because of COVID rules. But Notre Dame has a standing open invitation to the Naval Academy to always play them in football because the Navy essentially saved Notre Dame to keep it open. So we have a lot of great players in football and baseball going into the draft. And basketball doesn't become a pro. The NBA doesn't form until 1946. Hockey is still the original 6 teams. Hockey is still not really a big American sport. It's really these two, along with horse racing and boxing. Horse racing continues, although it's a little bit tougher when a lot more horses are being drafted for the war effort. Usually the thoroughbred horses are okay. Boxers are also being drafted into the military. So it's affecting all these sports, right? There's just too many soldiers that are needed to leave these untouched. So what ends up happening is when you have, especially let's talk about Major League Baseball, there are star players that are going into the military to basically play baseball in the military. There are a whole lot of players who are filling out rosters in the majors who aren't stars, who are still being drafted to the military. They're actually going to really fight. So Major League Baseball can keep playing, but they're losing all their best players. So you're going to see some weird instances in the 40s of guys playing. They are scraping the bottom of the barrel in some cases for players. The Reds have a 16-year-old play for them who actually comes back years later and is actually a pretty good pitcher for them. But they bring him up as a 16-year-old. This picture here, Pete Gray. I don't know if you've noticed this before I said it, but he has one arm. He has one arm. He does not have another arm. He plays in the major leagues. He's actually not terrible. I wouldn't say he's good, but he's not terrible considering he only has one arm. Um, you see a lot of guys, a lot of star players who are retired or past their prime. They're in their 40s. They come back to play a little bit during World War II. You see a lot of guys debut who are 17, 18, 19 years old. They're just trying to piece together teams to get by to make it through another season. So you see some weird stuff like the St. Louis Browns, who Pete Gray plays for, one of the worst franchises in baseball. They make the World Series in 1944. They lose to the Cardinals, but they still make the World Series. So you see a lot of weird stuff happening during World War II in these various sports. And this you see a lot during this war of leaders saying, we won World War II, and of course we do in 1945. A lot of leaders like Dwight Eisenhower, other big names, are claiming the U.S. won the war specifically because American boys play football. That's really a claim they make because of the physicality of football, because of how it builds camaraderie, because of how it's so physical, it's so brutal, it's preparing these boys for the brutality of war. That's why they're winning World War II. Yeah, the Germans are playing soccer, right? Soccer can't compare to the brutality of football in preparation for combat. This is the idea people had. Most people today don't really buy that. Just because you have some good football players doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win a war. There's a lot more that goes into winning a war than that. But this is people felt this very strongly because U.S. has a greater sporting background, especially in football. This is why they won the war. Okay, so sports are still playing a major role during these wars. Also, if we look internationally, the Olympics are canceled 1944 and I believe 1940 as well. So a lot of things are kind of screeching to a halt on the international sports stage. But the American sports are piecing away. They're finding a way to piece it together through World War II so they can emerge on the other side. So here's your primary source analysis. And I put this on Canvas so you can take a closer look at this or take a longer look at it. I'm going to explain what it is. Kennesaw M. Landis, he is the commissioner of Major League Baseball. He was put as commissioner after the Black Sox scandal, if you remember, in 1920. He's still there in 1942. January 15th, 1942 is only about a month and a half after Pearl Harbor. Okay, so the U.S. has been in the war for a month and a half. And essentially, Landis here, he's writing the President of the United States. He's writing a letter to FDR, President Roosevelt. And he's saying, listen, we want to keep going playing baseball. If you decide that we shouldn't, okay, fine. But I'm going to make my case that we should continue playing baseball. And here are the reasons why. And you're going to be able to read those reasons why. Okay. So basically, I want you to kind of analyze, what does this mean? How does this show how Americans felt about the importance of sports, especially baseball, during World War II? Why was it so important that Americans keep playing baseball during World War II? Okay. It's not much to read here. Okay. So it should be pretty quick, but it is pretty rich in being able to give you attitudes about how people felt about this during the 1940s. Okay. That'll be due Tuesday. You don't have a discussion, remember, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, good. So this should be posted fairly soon on YouTube. I guess they might give like a copyright issue because of the George Carlin video I showed, but it shouldn't be a problem for you. You should still be able to see it. Just like that White Sox video I showed you, that also had a similar issue pop up with it, but it was not for you guys. It's just if you live in other countries, you might not be able to see it. So that'll be up soon. Next week, we'll talk about basketball. Next week, I'll also introduce everything about your final paper. So you have like a month to work on that. I don't want you to worry about it yet, but that's why I'm going to introduce it next week. If you have any questions, let me know. But as I said before, once I introduce that final paper, I would like to meet with each of you guys at least once through video form so we can kind of talk about what are you thinking about writing for your paper, how's it going, et cetera, et cetera. It's easier to do it that way than just by email. Okay. But we're almost halfway through the class now, so things are going quickly. Thank you guys for keeping up with your work. Keep up the good work, especially for this primary source analysis. And you'll see me on here again in a few days. All right. Good. Okay. Make sure to watch this video. Make sure to do the analysis, and we'll learn about basketball next week.